If you're new to recording and producing your own music out of your home, audio production can seem pretty overwhelming. But there is one thing that all great music producers have in common, and we're going to talk about that today. Now, there are 3 separate steps that lead to a final licensable version of your song, and they are songwriting, production, and mixing. Today, I want to talk to you specifically about production. And production is the process of recording and assembling all of the instruments and all of the sounds that you're going to use that will make up the final recorded version of your song. Now, if you're new to production and you're just starting to build your own home studio, your first question may be, what DAW should I get? And it's a great question. But if you've been following me for a while and you've been absorbing the 4 steps that I, share with how to generate consistent sync placements, when I hear someone ask that question, what DAW should I get? To me, it's the same as someone asking, who should I send my music to? It's a great question. It's just the wrong first question. Hopefully you understand why, if you've been following me for a while, when it comes to the question of who should I send my music to, right? You have to show up to the party with the goods. You can't just show up and send people your music and hope that they figure out what to do with it. That's where my 4-step process comes in, right? We really help you deliver the goods so that when you knock on the doors of music supervisors, music editors, music libraries, and they open the door, you have everything ready to go so that they welcome you in with open arms. So getting back to production, what DAW should I get? Great question, just the wrong first question. Here's why. All great music producers, music engineers, anyone who's involved in the technical aspect of recording music, they understand one thing very thoroughly, and that is signal flow. This is why they can produce high-quality professional recordings and regardless really of where they're going. They can go to a professional, multi-million-dollar studio, or they can go to your bonus room and work on a very simple setup. They're going to get high-quality audio regardless of what they're using, whether that be the DAW, the recording media, whether it's tape, whether it's a hard drive, whether they're using a console or just a couple pieces of outboard gear. They're going to get high-quality audio because they understand signal flow. DAWs, as you're going to see in a minute or two, they all do the same thing, all right? Pro Tools does the same thing Logic does. Logic does the same thing Studio One Pro does. Studio One Pro does the same thing that Digital Performer does, etc. They're all the same, okay? But it's just a matter of really understanding signal flow. So let's talk about signal flow. And signal flow starts with the audio source. This could be a vocalist, it could be a guitar, it could be keyboards, it could be drums, horns, orchestra, whatever, all right? We always start with the goal of capturing the best audio possible. Now, with technology, we can manipulate audio and we can do a lot of things, which is pretty mind-blowing what we can do to fix audio. We can take a vocalist who's out of tune and out of time, and we can tune them, and we can adjust the timing of their line to really lock in with the tempo of the song. And you would really never know that work was done to the audio. But one thing we can't do is we really can't change the character of it. We can't take a 60-year-old vocalist and make them sound like a 16-year-old. Okay, if you want a youthful vocal on your track, then you really have to start off with a younger individual singing for you. Now, if they're not a great singer, you can still really manipulate that vocal and get it in time and in tune, but you can't really change the character of that audio source to start with. So signal flow always starts with the initial audio source. And we want to capture that the best way right from the beginning, the utmost quality. And most of the time, that's going to start with a microphone. Unless we're doing something direct like keyboards or whatever, we're going to use a microphone. And there are 2 types of microphones. There are condenser microphones and there are dynamic microphones. Condenser microphones are going to be your higher quality studio grade microphones. Dynamic microphones are what we're used to using when we perform live. Something like a Shure SM58 or a Shure SM57, those are dynamic microphones. They're great for live. They're great for loud instruments like loud guitars or a snare drum. But really, when we're trying to capture great vocals that have a lot of depth and clarity and whatnot, we're going to want to use a high-quality condenser microphone. And really, the main difference that you'll notice between a dynamic and a condenser microphone is that a condenser microphone requires power. Sometimes you may see a little button on your interface or your mixing board or whatever that says 48V or phantom power. If you're using a condenser microphone, you have to hit that button. That supplies power to the microphone. All right. So we want to start with a high quality microphone that complements the audio source. Then we send that signal into a preamp. Now, the preamp will take the low-level mic signal, which is generally between minus 40 and minus 60 dB, and it's going to raise it to a listenable level. Now, if you're running direct, say, out of a keyboard, those come out at line level. And we have semi-pro gear that sends signal around minus 10, and then we have pro-level gear that sends level up to plus 4. So as you can see, there's a wide range here of levels that we're dealing with, anything from minus 60 dB to plus 4. So that's where a preamp comes in. And each preamp is going to give a certain quality and tonal character to that sound. So after the microphone, we want to hit a nice high quality preamp. The very next thing that we're going to do is we're going to adjust the EQ of that sound. There might be some frequencies that we know we're not going to use, or they're just problem frequencies. So we want to carve those out, or maybe we want to accentuate some other specific frequencies. So that's where an EQ unit is going to come into play. And then we're going to run that through a compressor just to tame any types of transients in the signal that might clip the audio and cause distortion. All right. Now that's our signal flow before we get to the interface. And all audio enters into the computer or the digital domain through an audio interface. Now, again, if you're new to the home recording world, the two most common features that you may look for in an interface are going to be the price and the number of inputs. And those are great things to be aware of. However, you cannot forget to look at the types of inputs that the interface has. Let's talk about these because these are very important. One of the most important types of inputs that you're going to have and outputs that you're going to have through your interface is what's called balanced. Now, balanced inputs and outputs come in two forms. They come in XLR, which as you can see in this image is basically a microphone cable that you're familiar with already, as well as what's called a TRS quarter inch. Okay, TRS stands for tip ring sleeve. These are both balanced cables. Now your interface may have what's known as unbalanced quarter inch inputs and outputs. These are what we're familiar with. If you're a guitar player, you're familiar with these. If you're a keyboard player, these are probably the most common quarter inch cables that you see all over the place. All right. And it's just a tip sleeve. That's what the TS stands for. And these are unbalanced. And then another type of input that you're going to find and output that you'll find on a interface is known as SPDIF. That stands for Sony Philips Digital Interface. And these are your digital inputs and outputs. Okay. Now let's talk about the difference between these. Unbalanced cables consist of two connectors, hot and ground. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Spinal Tap, or you've played a gig and you're a guitar player and maybe you had a long cable, suddenly you hear like a radio station come through your amplifier. That's because you're using an unbalanced cable. Cables are basically just long, wires. What is a long wire? It's basically an antenna. So if you have a really long quarter inch unbalanced cable that you're using, you have a high likelihood of picking up some unwanted radio frequencies that are just traveling throughout the air. And then that has potential to find its way onto your recording or, through your amplifier and whatnot. So unbalanced cables do not protect us from extraneous frequencies and radio signal that might get in the way. That's where balanced cables come in. Balanced cables consist of 3 connectors. You have hot, cold, and ground. And with balanced cables, both the hot and cold wires, they carry the same audio signal, but in reverse polarity. So that way, when the signal is summed together at the end of the cable run and the polarity is reversed again, all of the noise, all of the radio interference that could have gotten picked up along that cable run is going to be canceled out. And that creates a pure representation of the original audio. So when we're recording professional quality music, we want to make sure that we're using balanced cables. Now, the next thing to think about when it comes to your interface and actually sending your audio into your DAW relates to the bit rate and the sample rate. What does this mean? Well, 16-bit audio can record 65,536 discrete values for loudness, or basically a dynamic range of 96 dB. That's a lot. That sounds like a lot, doesn't it? That sounds pretty amazing. But we also know that we can record in 24-bit. What's the difference? Well, 24-bit audio can record 16,777,216 discrete values for loudness, or a dynamic range of 144 dB. Now, when it comes to sample rates simply describe the number of samples or snapshots that are taken per second to capture the audio wave. 44.1K takes 44,100 snapshots per second. 48K, as you can guess, takes 48,000 snapshots per second. And let's combine sample rate and bit rate into a photo analogy. Sometimes it's a little more easy to visualize it this way. The depth of color is going to be the bit rate, and the focus or the clarity of the image is going to be the sample rate. So a black and white grainy photo is going to have obviously a low bit rate and a low sample rate. And of course, a vibrant HD photo is going to have a high bit rate and a high sample rate. All right. So hope that creates some clarity for you when it comes to your interface. Now at this point, once we sent signal through the interface, that's when it enters into our DAW. All right. And there are a number of popular DAWs on the market. We have Pro Tools, Digital Performer, Reason, Studio One Pro, Logic Pro, Reaper, Ableton Live, Cubase, Cakewalk, GarageBand. There's a bunch of other ones out there. Most of these are Mac and PC based. A couple of them are PC only. A couple of them are Mac only. So you're going to have to be aware of what kind of computer you want to use in the long run, especially when it comes to choosing your DAW. And when it comes to choosing your DAW, the first thing I would ask you is, what are your collaborators using? If your co-writers are all using, say, Pro Tools, then don't you think it would make a lot of sense for you to use Pro Tools as well? Because if you ever have a problem, you can just pick up the phone and call them and they can help you through it. It's a lot easier to get quick answers from people who are familiar with the same program versus asking someone who uses Pro Tools how to do something in Logic and they're not familiar with it. All right. So I'd start with, what are your collaborators using? Now, if your collaborators are using a variety of DAWs, then the next question that I would have for you is, which one feels the best to you when you are watching your collaborators work on their DAW, or when you're just watching various tutorials online? You're going to be spending a lot of time looking at that interface, that graphic interface on the screen in front of you. So this is something that I find is so important, and it's also very specific to us. I have friends of mine who love working on one particular platform. When I get behind that platform, visually, it just doesn't make the most sense to me. But then they look at the platform I use and they have the same feeling. It doesn't make the most sense to them. And that's perfectly fine. We're all different. So it's important to not just go like, oh, I'm going to use this program because so-and-so uses it. Find the program that really resonates with you, because you're going to spend a lot of time with it. And the final thing when it comes to choosing your DAW is to test drive them. Most of them offer free demos for a short amount of time. Could be a week, could be 14 days. Some are up to 30 days. All right, give them a shot. See which one resonates with you when you're actually in the program using it. The reality is this: a Honda Accord really isn't any different than a Hyundai Sonata. They're both going to get you to work. What's different about them is the experience of driving them, all right? Actually sitting in the driver's seat. And it's the same thing with the DAW. The reality is that all DAWs do the exact same thing. They allow you to record, arrange, and mix audio and MIDI tracks. Okay, they also allow you to use third-party plugins and virtual instruments. And that leads us to plugins. Now, there are various plugin formats that we have to be aware of that are specific to the DAW that we choose to use. One of them is called VST. Now, most PC-based DAWs will use a form of VST, either VST2 or VST3. There's AU. This is most commonly used by Apple products like Logic and GarageBand. We have AAX, which is very specific to Pro Tools. Now, this is not a comprehensive list of DAW plugin formats, but I just wanted to give you an idea that there is a variety of them out there. So you are going to have to be aware of which format your DAW uses when it comes time for you to buy plugins. Now, what are plugins? Plugins are awesome. They give you access to the gear that could originally only be found in multi-million-dollar recording studios. And here's the thing about plugins. If you can imagine it, there's probably already a dozen plugins or more on the market that will allow you to accomplish that particular task that you're imagining sonically. All right. And when we're talking about plugins, we also have to talk about virtual instruments. Virtual instruments are very much the same way. There are a variety of virtual instrument formats, just like there were with plugins. Okay, we have VST, we have AU, we have AAX, and a few other ones. All right. But when it comes to virtual instruments, most virtual instruments will fall into one of two categories. The first is sample playback. And a perfect example of this would be virtually any drum VI, where you're triggering the drum samples, say if you're using a keyboard based on what note you're playing on the keyboard, and you're triggering the specific sample also based on the velocity of how hard you're hitting that key. And that's it. You're just triggering that specific sample based on those parameters, which key you're hitting and how hard. Now, I have a virtual instrument that I created for Virtu Instruments called Acoustic Legends, and it's a sample playback virtual instrument of acoustic guitars. It works the exact same way as I just described. Now, the second category is synthesis, and this is where there's algorithms that are creating that sound, obviously based on what the programmer programmed in and whatnot. There is a third category that's a combination of both samples and synthesis. An example of this would be Apollo Cinematic Guitars. This is also another virtual instrument that I created with Virtu Instruments. And here we took actual samples of electric guitars and we combined it with algorithms, synthesis algorithms that really create their own thing. So it's playing back the sample, but it's also manipulating the sample and adding all these other synthetic elements to that sample to where you don't even know it's actually a guitar. That's why it's called cinematic guitars. They're very unique sounds, all right? So those are your two main categories, and then of course you have the third category that combines them. But virtual instruments as a whole, they're played via a MIDI controller, most often a keyboard, and then they're recorded onto either a MIDI track or an instrument track, just depending on what your DAW of choice calls it. And the MIDI performance can then be edited within the DAW, and of course the virtual instruments are going to be triggered by the MIDI track that you've recorded. At that point, you can render that MIDI track with the virtual instrument to an audio track and process the audio the exact same way you would process any other audio in the session. So that was a lot, and I hope this was inspiring for you, especially if you're new to audio production and home recording. It can be pretty daunting when we start off on that journey, but even more important than all the gear and the manufacturers and whatnot, what's most important for us to understand at any level of our audio production career is signal flow. When we understand signal flow, everything else becomes easy. And I hope this gave you some clarity on that. All right, we'll chat with you later.